The harvest moon hung low, casting a muted glow that scattered across the cotton fields like spilled silver. The plantation buzzed with forced festivity, the air thick with the scent of ripe earth and wood smoke from nearby hearth fires. At the center of this brittle celebration, the Harvest Festival, a day meant to honor the toil of many gathered planters and slaves alike under a veil of uneasy truce. Yet beneath the warm laughter and clang of iron pots, a colder, darker current writhed. Was this festival truly a moment of reprieve, or merely the quiet before a reckoning? The year was 1843, deep in the Black Belt of Georgia, where the soil's black velvet promised a bountiful cotton yield. The plantation was a complex organism, tall oak beams groaning beneath the weight of the overseer's quarters, rows of slave cabins dark and cramped with sweat-stained cloth, and the sharp tang of pine resin. The enslaved people moved about with the precision of the well-rehearsed, forever under the watchful eyes of overseers whose whip hands were as quick as their tongues were cruel. Household routines wove an unending cycle of labor, dawn fields and dusk chores, the cotton gin's relentless rattle, feeding a global hunger for King Cotton. Every calloused hand and haunted gaze bore silently the burden of a system designed to extract life and spirit alike. Elijah lingered near the edge of the festival's clamor, a shadow among the restless crowds. His eyes flicked over the harsh faces of overseers, loudly recounting their ruthlessness, as if worn badges. The leathered creak of boots on hard-packed earth punctuated their boasts, sounds sharp as the snap of a whip. Abeni's presence close beside him, her arms steady yet hands trembling slightly beneath the coarse fabric of her dress, was a tether amid the gathering storm. Together, they exchanged no words, only glances laden with histories too heavy for any festival cheer. Every shout and clatter threatened to fracture the fragile calm. Beneath the colored flags and the dance of flickering lanterns, a slow fury fermented. Could such outward revelry mask the burning embers of rebellion? The records do not say, but the tension was tangible, like the sudden hush before the crack of a branch underfoot. Whispers passed through the gathered enslaved like a secret wind. Tales of overseers' cruelty seeped from cracked lips, hands bruised by the cotton stalk, backs aching from lashes too many to count. Elijah's jaw tightened as he listened, each story a hammer striking his resolve. The festival's roasted meats and sweet corn, meant to be symbols of harvest blessing, took on a bitter edge. Was it justice or madness that first whispered poison's name between two desperate hearts? Abeni, steeped in the hushed wisdom of her foremothers, keepers of herbs and roots once thought lost, slipped away from the festive glare to gather the bitter leaves in nightshade, the subtle poisons hidden in plain sight. Their act, quietly born in shadows, would soon redefine the cost of survival on this haunted land. Would you dare wield such invisible power, where discovery meant death? The festival's warmth, thick as the sticky Georgia night air, was a cruel veneer over the cold, unyielding laws that governed every breath. Overseers bragged of their unchecked dominion, their voices weaving dread beneath the laughter. Yet, among the enslaved, a new language emerged, a code veiled in herbs, a pact sworn by eyes that knew the shape of sorrow and the weight of chains. Elijah's gaze lingered on the smudged shapes of lantern light dancing nervously against the wood, silent witnesses to a plan born of desperation. In this fragile moment, between feast and fury, the festival's shadow deepened, promising a reckoning the plantation had never seen. The last ember flickered on the edge of the fields, where cotton waited to be cut, its whiteness like cold fire beneath the dark leaves. As candles were lit in the great house, Elijah and Abeni's silent rebellion began to stir, an unseen poison threading through pots and platters. The festival's gaiety twisted slowly, as hidden acts carved a path toward irrevocable change. Here, in the sweltering heat and watchful night, the harvest shadow grew long, enfolding all in its cold embrace. The poison was their voice, the festivity their battlefield. What price lay ahead when survival demanded the subtlest betrayal? The fields would remember long after the sun's first light. The plantation's vast fields lay heavy under the August sun, the soil black and fertile, the infamous Black Belt of Georgia, a name borrowed from earth, not skin, but that too bore weight here. This was 1843, an era when the Southern economy clung to the pulsing heart of King Cotton. It was a world of endless rows of stalks, each ball a promise of wealth for the planter and suffering for the enslaved. The system functioned like a grim factory. Overseers slapped their whips against the humid air, orchestrating the relentless rhythm of field labor. Cotton gins rattled in the background, machines that had transformed the industry but deepened the chains, making the demand for human labor grow fiercer still. Plantation life split into rigid roles. The planter, often distant or indulgent in his estate's grand house, lived surrounded by relics of gentility, polished wood, fine linens, the faint scent of tobacco and pipe smoke lingering like a cloak. The slaves, housed in small cabins of rough-hewn logs and cracked windows, endured squalor. Their world was measured in work hours, lash strikes, and whispered prayers hidden beneath the magnolia's shadow. The distinction between management and labor was as stark as the difference between silk handkerchiefs and burlap sacks. Here, every breath of air was weighted by the unyielding hierarchy of ownership and survival. Amidst this oppressive landscape, the harvest festival was paradoxical, an occasion of forced celebration held as the fields yielded their burden. The festival's warmth, a sudden burst of music, food, and feigned camaraderie, slipped unevenly over the land. Lanterns flickered in the gathering dusk, their oil lamps casting trembling light on sundered faces. Beneath laughter, the overseer's cruelty rippled unchecked, sharp words punctuated by harsher deeds. The creak of leather harnesses and the scrape of rough cloth mingled with the distant pounding of drums, setting a cadence both festive and foreboding. The plantation's opulent veneer barely concealed the simmering unrest, a poison that no feast could mask. Elijah moved silently among the throng, his gaze steady but wary, his hands clenched unconsciously, fingers pressing raw against calloused palms. Near him, Abeni's eyes darted to every shadow, her breath shallow beneath the weight of anticipation. The festival's colors, the reds and ochres of the setting sun, the greens of freshly cut corn husks, twisted into garlands, clashed violently with the cold edge of unspoken plans. The warmth of roasting meats and sweet cider felt strange upon their tongues, flavor ringing sour against the bitter taste of rebellion preparing in secret corners. Their resistance was slow burning, a faint smoke rising beneath roaring fires. Their silence spoke volumes. Would you risk the invisible knife of poison in a world where discovery meant chains tightened or death came swift? Between the dancing flames and the rhythmic beat of feet, a quiet exchange of hope and dread passed. The laws of the day were merciless, slave codes penned to snuff out even whispered disobedience, yet the unyielding human spirit pressed against the iron bars. Elijah and Abeni knew that the harvest festival was more than ritual. It was an opportunity hidden in plain sight, a moment when watchful eyes might falter in celebration's glow. Here, in the hideous beauty of forced festivity, their plan took root. The cotton fields, moonlit and somber, held their breath as the night deepened. The aroma of wood smoke, coaxed from distant chimneys, carried a muted promise of change, invisible as the poison that would soon move through the banquet. The festival's gaiety crept toward its dark horizon. Something hidden, potent and slow, was seeping into the teeth of that feast. The harvest shadow lengthened across earth and soul alike, binding them in silent conspiracy. In doing so, it wrote a new chapter in the history of resistance that this land, so soaked with pain, would never forget. The air lay thick with the earthy fragrance of harvested grain, mingling sharply with the acrid tang of smoke from the cook fires that dotted the plantation grounds. On the surface, the Harvest Festival in 1843 offered a fleeting reprieve, an opportunity to gather in fragile unity beneath fluttering banners woven from faded cloth, their colors dulled by sun and time. The great house stood poised like a silent sentinel, its weathered clapboards catching what little light remained. But this day was no mere celebration. It was a stark reminder of the brutal latticework of power that girded the plantation. Richly appointed rooms brimmed with silver and glass, while beyond, the slave quarters' crude constructions of rough timber and mud, huddled in suffocating rows. Here, the lives of hundreds of men and women were compressed into hard labor and harder silences. The Black Belt soil bore witness to a system as relentless as the sun beating down upon it. The cotton gin's relentless clatter had fueled a surge in cotton production, transforming Georgia's plantation economy into a sprawling empire of sweat and blood. Overseers, hardened and merciless, patrolled the fields. Their calls echoed across the acres, cutting through the low hum of pickers, stooped beneath towering stalks. Their presence was a constant, a sharp reminder that every moment was measured and owned. Yet it was not only the land that bore scars, but also the humanity beneath. Slaves were not mere laborers, they were bargaining chips, property to be bought and sold, their bodies marked by scars and lashes the ledger often ignored. Among the enslaved, Elijah and Abeni moved like ghosts within this charged atmosphere. Elijah's gaze bore a patient, unyielding weight. His hands, scarred but steady, brushed absent-mindedly the coarse weave of his faded shirt, its rough texture a daily reminder of his place. Abeni, close beside him, her breath catching ever so slightly in the humid air, held tightly a small bundle of herbs, a living testament to her resistance. The festival's rowdy dance of drums and voices surged around them, but did not reach the tight circle of their shared resolve. The festive tables groaned under the weight of food, cornbread, roasted pig, and fruit harvested from exploited land, but beneath the outward cheer, a deadly silence settled between them. Could a silent poison unravel this dangerous masquerade before it was too late? Would you trust in the power of such subtle vengeance when the price of exposure was swift and merciless? The overseer's boasts, harsh tales of domination and punishment, filled the thick air, their words sharp and jagged. The law was unforgiving. Slave codes were etched not in stone but in pain, designed to crush rebellion before it could grow. Yet within the slave quarters, quiet exchanges passed like rain through cracked earth, words of ancestral knowledge, secret herbs and cures that held darker purposes. Abeni's fingers skillfully crushed bitter leaves wrapped in cloth, the scent of crushed nightshade and hemlock, rising faint against the humid Georgia night. Their plan ripened, as slow and sure as poison seeping into satins of flesh and bone. The cotton fields stretched out, under the moon's pale gleam, an endless wave of whiteness muted beneath heavy leaves. The harvest festival's flickering lanterns cast uncertain shadows on faces marked by hardship and hope. Somewhere beneath the laughter and music, beneath the clinking of cups and clatter of dishes, a quiet act of rebellion took hold. Abeni's herbs, mixed with care and silent fury, transformed tables into battlegrounds. The festival's warmth turned cold as the poison crept unseen, an invisible chain tightening around the overseers. In the night air thick with the scent of earth and ash, the harvest shadow lengthened. What future would unfold when poison spoke louder than whip or word? The land, their survival waited with bated breath. The harvest festival, unfurled amidst the simmering tension of a plantation suspended between brutality and brittle celebration. The banquet tables groaned with food harvested through endless toil, cornbread browned by open flames, pig roasted to crackling perfection, sweet peaches gleaming like stolen jewels beneath the flickering light of lanterns hung haphazardly from oak limbs. Yet the laughter was brittle, a brittle crystal fracturing beneath the weight of fear and fury. Overseers swaggered with false bravado, trading cruel stories, brushing gleaming boots against raw hands, their voices rising sharp as lash snaps. The very soil beneath the festival's gaiety seemed soaked with quiet dread, and the smoke-scented air carried whispers neither planter nor overseer chose to hear. Elijah's eyes darted beneath heavy lids, measuring each overseer's step, noting the clench of a jaw or the twitch of a specious smile. His hands, scarred from the cotton fields, flexed minutely, a subtle tremor of contained rage and resolve. Abeni stood nearby, her throat tight, clutching a small cloth bundle filled with bitter herbs, their scent faint beneath the heavier smells of roasting meat and sweat. Their quiet resistance had grown like a hidden root, invisible beneath the festival's planted smiles. They traded no words, but their glance, a barely perceptible tilt of eyes, carried the weight of an unspoken plan, born from ancestral rights and necessity. Would the scent of crushed herbs in their hands be enough to ripple the cruel order beneath the festival veneer? Voices around them rose and fell like waves against the shore of their caution. Overseers boasted of their cruelties, their laughter ringing hollow amid the darkened corners where slaves crouched, eyes wide and silent. The festival was a paradox, ceremony and threat, mask and menace. The laws binding this grim world were merciless, written to snuff out even the faintest spark of revolt. Yet somewhere in the gathering shadows, the power of poison conspired with sweat and breath, with whispered prayers to gods long silenced by chains. Abeni's fingers moved deftly, recalling old wisdoms of root and leaf, knowledge forbidden but alive, a quiet rebellion folded into the fabric of the meal. Would this hidden art be the reckoning that trembled just out of sight? As the night deepened, lantern flames danced, casting fractured light on faces drawn tight with anticipation and fear. The harvest's cruel bounty, the cotton, the fields, the sweat-streaked backs, loomed heavy in every corner. The festival's warmth faded to a cold edge, the poison threading through dishes silently, a slow betrayal. The plantation held its breath beneath the open skies, the gathering drumbeats of festivity turning into the silent heartbeats of retribution. The fields whispered beneath the moonlight, carrying the hidden weights of justice and survival. The harvest festival had changed. What began as feast was poised to become a reckoning, written in bitter herbs and unyielding courage. The glow of lantern light wavered through the heavy dusk as overseers collapsed, one by one, a macabre dance of sudden illness unraveling the forced gaiety. The harvest festival's feast, once a testament to the land's bounty and the plantation's cruel hierarchy, had turned grotesque. Voices fell silent, replaced by gasps and hurried whispers. Many clutching stomachs writhed in pain, the sense of roasted meats and sweetened cakes soured by the invisible venom now pulsing through their veins. Panic rose with the choking smoke from hearth fires, while the great house's walls seemed to close in, suffused with a dread far colder than the humid air outside. Elijah stood apart, the tension knotting his lean frame, but his gaze calm and purposeful. His hands, roughened from years of planting and harvesting cotton, clenched a twisted cloth, a small, pungent bundle of bitter herbs and crushed roots gathered long before the festival's false warmth. Nearby, Abeni's eyes shone fierce with silent resolve, her presence a steady current beneath the chaos. Accounts suggest the poison was a slow and cunning force, a hidden weapon wielded not in brute defiance, but in careful reprisal. For each overseer felled, a tale of cruelty etched deeper into the land's stained soil. Yet the festival's bright blaze had already become a gathering shadow, a reckoning breathing beneath flickering lamps. Whispers crept through the quarters as the plantation's rigid order began to fracture. The overseer's boisterous commands dissolved into frantic chatter, broken coughs, and the sharp scrape of hurried footsteps. The scent of burning rope and bitter herbs mingled with the acrid tang of fear. Slaves exchanged furtive glances, wordless tales of endurance and shared grief passing like a muted pulse. Would you recognize the moment when survival tipped toward rebellion? Here in the fragile lull between feast and fury, Elijah and Abeni's quiet reckoning took root, an ancient defiance wrapped in the fabric of leaves and roots, striking unseen but undeniable. The festival's embers faded to ash as guards surged through the quarters, searching, questioning, punishing. The heavy weight of plantation justice fell hard, chains rattled, rope tightened, whispered betrayals turning loud. Yet even as punishment thundered, the poison's legacy endured, an invisible fracture in the plantation's foundation. The harvest moon traced cold lines over cotton fields, still heavy with their burden, and the land remembered the bitter price paid in silence and shadow. The poison banquet was not an end but a beginning, an echo of resistance that would ripple through the generations yet to come. Would this hidden rebellion, forged beneath festival lights, ever find its voice beyond the soil's dark keep? The plantation's power brokers gathered low and tight, their voices thick with fear masked as fury. The overseers who had survived the poisoned feast exchanged tight glances, their bravado brittle as cracked glass. The planter himself, an imposing figure, clad in faded finery, but with eyes sharp as broken iron, demanded answers, his word law beneath the heavy beams of the great house. The codes of the day carved a grim path. Any act of resistance, especially one so covert and deadly, warranted swift and brutal justice. Torture, imprisonment, and death hung like dark clouds over the enslaved quarters. Yet beneath the planter's rage simmered a deeper, more unsettling terror that the invisible poison was only the first strike within a growing storm. Elijah and Abeni became the focus of a relentless manhunt. Slaves were questioned under the lash, their whispered solidarity tested against rising chains of betrayal. The heavy scent of burning rope and smoldering ash filled the humid air, mixing with the harsh cries of warning and confession. The shadows stretched long, and trust grew thin as whispers bore terrible consequences. The planter's militia swept the quarters, breaking down doors and probing beneath floorboards, the sound of splintering wood echoing the fracturing community. Every cracked lock and tightened chain spoke of fear, of a desperate system clinging to control amid the tremors of revolt. How far could rebellion reach before it was snuffed out? Would sacrifice alone suffice when the weight of law and loyalty bore down like a millstone? For Elijah and Abeni, survival demanded more than courage. It required inhabiting the space between silence and sound, light and smoke, life and death. The records imply their fate was sealed not just by the poison, but by the unyielding belief that control must be absolute. Yet within the plantation's strict order, cracks began to form, fissures where stories of defiance passed from lips to ears in secret, where memory wrapped tight around root and leaf, where the harvest shadow promised something greater than despair. Each act of punishment only reinforced the brittle veneer of power, creating ghosts whose whispers carried far beyond the cotton fields. The harvest moon cast cold light over a land forever marked by poison's quiet strike. Though overseers lay fallen, and justice was dealt with cruel sharpness, the story of Elijah and Abeni had seeded itself into the soil, an echo of resistance etched in sweat, root, and blood. The festival's veneer of celebration shattered, replaced by a haunting reckoning that refused to fade. The poison endured, an unseen chain linking oppressors and survivors in a complex dance. And in the shifting shadows of 1843 Georgia, the harvest shadow lengthened still, its legacy woven into the fabric of history, waiting to be unearthed and told anew. The burning sun dipped low as tension coiled tight on the plantation, rippling through every worn board and weathered face. Inside the great house, the planter's voice thundered, a command steeped in cold authority. The overseers, those cruel arbiters of daily misery, bore marks of the night's poison but clung to fractured strength. Their threats rang out like the crack of whip leather upon flesh, enforcing a brutal code where silence was chained to violence. Laws crafted to crush hope and rebellion were more than ink on paper. They were instruments of terror wielded without mercy. Yet beneath this harsh veneer, a deeper terror gripped the white overseers. The fear of rebellion, the dread of uprising like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The manhunt was ruthless and relentless. Slave quarters, cramped and damp with sweat, were invaded by harsh footsteps and rough hands. Doors forced open revealed beds stripped bare, bundles hidden beneath rough floorboards. The acrid, suffocating smell of burning rope mingled with whispered confessions torn from cracked lips under lash and threat. The oppressive humidity clung to skin like a second jailer. Tensions inched toward breaking as suspicion wormed its way through the enslaved community, turning quiet brotherhood into fragile alliances and fragile alliances into whispered betrayals. What price would survival demand when every glance might betray a comrade? The hunt was not only for poisoners, but for the soul of a people driven to desperate defiance. Would defiance alone forge a path out of unyielding chains? Elijah and Abeni moved in shadows, where silence was their armor and memory their weapon. The plantation, a furnace of fear and control, sought to extinguish even the faintest spark of rebellion. But records imply that the roots of resistance ran deep, anchored in stories passed from elder mouths, in the bitter taste of crushed roots and leaves, in the unquenchable hunger for freedom buried beneath cotton fields. Each chain tightened by overseer hand only served to cradle the fragile hope of escape and uprising. The harvest's shadow grew long and cold, but it carried a seed of courage, of vengeance, and of a reckoning yet to come. As dawn broke over the fields heavy with morning dew, the plantation stood poised on the edge of change. The feast's poisoned legacy lingered, etched into the flesh of overseers and the whispered prayers of those still shackled. Even as the fight was crushed, the story of Elijah and Abeni endured, a testament to resistance's quiet power. The fields, soaked in sweat and blood, bore witness to a truth too deep for law to bury. And in that soil, the harvest's shadow stretched beyond the night, weaving defiance into the very fabric of time, an enduring call for justice that would echo far beyond 1843. The smoke of the burned fields mingled with the acrid scent of despair as the plantation grappled with its unraveling order. The poison had struck deeply, wounds bending the overseer's cruel grip, but igniting a tempest of fear beneath the surface. News of the uprising spread like wildfire, whispered in concealed corners and among trembling lips. The aftermath was a brutal symphony of retribution. Chains rattled, cries echoed through the quarters, and the sharp taste of ash lingered in the air. Authority tightened its hold, wielding law and lash to crush what courage dared to bloom. Yet beneath this fierce suppression, a quiet resistance endured, memory and legend weaving a tapestry of defiance that the plantation's walls could not contain. The plantation's council convened in cold fury, planters and overseers, their faces etched with anxiety behind painted stoicism. The law was invoked with ruthless finality. Poisoners were to be hunted without mercy, every shadow turned inside out for evidence. The slave codes, ever the blunt instruments of control, became sharp knives in the hands of those thirsty for vengeance. Whippings multiplied. Punishments grew crueler as the ruling class sought to firm the cracks in their fragile fortress. But the records imply that even as bodies were broken, spirits bent neither wholly nor quietly. The stories of Elijah and Abeni whispered through slave quarters, fueling hope beneath the weight of chains. Could rebellion survive its bloodiest night? Would you trace the line between justice and vengeance when both are cloaked in darkness? The plantation was a crucible of moral ambiguity, where the law upheld cruelty but the oppressed found slivers of agency through subversion and survival. Elijah and Abeni's act, hidden in the nuances of taste and timing, was both an assertion of life and a dire gamble with death. Their legacy, blurred between legend and fact, carried forward a vital truth. Resistance takes many forms, carved quietly within the fiercest oppression. As the cotton fields bore witness to a new dawn, the harvest's shadow lingered, an unseen chain linking past and future struggles, an eternal question writ deep in the soil's memory. The fires from the disrupted harvest had barely settled when the plantation's council convened in grim urgency. The governing planter, an aging man with eyes sharp as razors beneath graying brows, presided over heated arguments amid the oppressive weight of law and order. The poisonings had shattered the fragile hierarchy, and swift measures were demanded to restore the breach. Slave codes, already cruel and exhaustive, were wielded like freshly sharpened blades. Any hint of insubordination met with inexorable punishment. The overseer's wounded pride translated into harsher vigilance, their gaze pierced deeper into every cabin and shadowed corner. Yet beneath this tightening grip, an invisible fracture had formed, one that law and lash could not completely mend. The aftermath was a measured storm of control and terror. Punishments escalated from public whippings to prolonged isolation, and the harsh scent of burning rope became an ominous reminder of the consequences of defiance. The plantation militia, a grim collective of planters and armed overseers, swept through the quarters with brutal efficiency. Every whispered word and furtive glance risked betrayal as fear cleaved paths between friends and family. Yet even as reprisal tore through flesh and spirit, stories of Elijah and Abeni endured, muted legends passed beneath breath, their courage a flame flickering amidst the dark. Would repression silence these stories, or would they seed future revolts beneath the soil? The plantation's maps lay worn and stained with sweat, but its boundaries were ever porous to resilience. The poisoned banquet was not an isolated act, but a chapter in a broader narrative of resistance, where survival intertwined with rebellion. The law's iron fists could break bodies, but failed to bind memory and hope. As cotton fields stretched endless beneath swollen skies, the harvest's shadow lengthened, one of whispered courage, bitter justice, and enduring humanity. Elijah and Abeni's legacy wove into history's tapestry, a subtle but indelible mark inviting reflection long after the smoke cleared. The land breathed still with their silent revolt, waiting for voices bold enough to unearth it. The plantation lay quiet beneath the oppressive weight of dawn, the aftermath of rebellion etched into every brittle breath and splintered plank. The fire that had once flickered in the hearts of Elijah, Abeni, and their comrades had been cruelly starved, stamped out by chains, revenge, and relentless fear. Yet while the overseers sought to reimpose order with whips and threats, the true reckoning was written in more subtle engravings, the silent scars carried in eyes that refused to forget and hearts that dared to hope. This was not only a story of punishment, but of the enduring fight for survival and dignity amidst enforced silence. The plantation's quarters bore witness to the heavy cost of revolt. The harsh scent of gunpowder and smoldering rope still clung to the humid air as overseers tightened their grasp with fresh, brutal enforcement of the slave codes. Bonds were forged anew in fear and suspicion, fragmenting communities once held together by whispered solidarity. Punishments escalated, beatings became more frequent, and families were torn apart by forced sales. Yet beneath this veneer of terror, stories of Elijah and Abeni, the lovers whose courage had stirred deadly justice, passed covertly from mouth to ear. Whispers became a balm, a reminder of resistance against an impossible yoke. How does one balance the heavy price of vengeance with the lighter hope of freedom? Would you carry the memory of such defiance forward when each day was marked by the shadow of loss? The rebellion's true legacy lay not in the fading bruises, but in the stories, the seedbed of courage passed between generations where hope and survival entwined. The harvest shadow stretched far beyond the torn fields, seeping into the very fabric of regional memory, calling listeners to reckon with a history often concealed by law and fear. Rebels died or were broken, but the spirit of defiance endured, a quiet testament that plague or punishment could never fully extinguish. In the earth beneath the cotton, dark, fertile, and unforgiving, Elijah and Abeni's story lay buried, waiting for those willing to uncover the truth beneath the silence. The plantation seemed to hold its breath long after the poisoned banquet ended. The harrowing quiet was broken only by the faint crackle of embers, the scent of smoldering wood drifting through the heavy summer air, like the last whisper of defiance before silence. The aftermath was a grim choreography of punishment and fear, a brutal dance conducted under the unyielding gaze of the planter and overseers. Laws, carved deep into antebellum Southern society, tightened like iron bands around bodies and souls alike. The slave codes, already designed to control and suppress, grew fiercer, forbidding assembly, education, and even the smallest gestures of autonomy. Yet within these confines, the invisible chains of memory and resistance refused to unravel. The heavy chains that bound the enslaved were not only physical, but woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Limited food rations replaced ancestral gardens, curtailing nourishment and health. Prohibitions on learning to read stifled minds, yet intensified the fire of whispered legends. In this oppressive aftermath, some records reveal a tragic drop in the well-being of those forced into submission, a somber testament to the cost of rebellion in body and spirit. But alongside the documentation of shattered lives lies oral history, stories passed in hushed tones about Elijah and Abeni, whose quiet defiance became a beacon amid ceaseless night. Their act of poison was not merely retaliation, but a profound message etched deep into the plantation's collective soul. Would you carry such a legacy, one marked by both brutal consequence and steady hope? The harvest's shadow stretched far beyond the fields they had tended, reaching into the hearts of generations yet unborn. Resistance took many forms, from whispered prayers beneath the moon to fleeting moments of solidarity in the slave quarters. It pulsed through the stories that would defy erasure. The plantation's history, saturated with suffering and courage, demands reckoning beyond the whips and chains. Elijah and Abeni's story, a dagger slipped into the feast, endures, a quiet insistence that beneath the weight of oppression, the human spirit still bends but does not break. The plantation, once a stage for harvest celebration, had transformed into a battlefield of despair and control. The poison that Elijah and Abeni wielded with quiet fury was but the opening note in a harsh symphony of repression and fear. Southern laws, sharpened by panic, tightened ever more around the enslaved. Education was banned outright. Gatherings were forbidden, lest ideas spread like wildfire. The threat of whipping, branding, and death loomed large, wielded without mercy to deter even the faintest spark of rebellion. Yet beneath the veneer of control, an unease festered, a dark truth that no law could fully erase. The earth, soaked with sweat and blood, bore silent witness to both suffering and resistance. The aftermath's toll extended beyond immediate punishment. Records and anthropological evidence suggest a marked decline in the health and nutrition of enslaved populations following uprisings. Food provisions grew meager. Those once allowed to tend small garden plots lost this fragile autonomy. The shift toward poorer rations deepened the physical and psychological scars of bondage. But among shadows and scarcity, stories of Elijah and Abeni passed like secret fires. Their courage, retold in whispered prayers and memorized tales, became lifelines, reminders that agency persisted despite the harshest subjugation. Would the legacy of their quiet defiance kindle the resolve of future generations? The harvest shadow stretched far beyond the cotton fields. It wrapped itself around the souls of those who lived and those yet to come, a persistent echo of defiance. Resistance took myriad forms, songs sung beneath breath, coded messages passed in silence, fleeting moments of solidarity. Though their bodies were bound, spirits refused to be chained. Elijah and Abeni's act, a poison slipped into the feast, remained an indelible mark upon history, defying erasure. Beneath layers of law, violence, and silence, their story endures, a testament that even in the darkest soil, seeds of resistance take root and persist.